Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 176, July 29th to August 4th, 1864. Last week we covered the actions in the Atlanta campaign. Johnson is out, Hood is in, and now he has launched some offensives against Sherman's army. These battles will not be the soaring successes that Hood would wish them to be. We will check back in on Atlanta in a future episode, but the writing is going to continue to be on the wall for the Confederacy in this region. This week we'll shift back to action in Virginia. We need to catch up on whatever we have missed in the last few weeks. While this will include the First Battle of Deep Bottom, we also need to conduct one of the more famous incidents of the siege and the war, the Battle of the Crater. Before we do that, though, we need to talk a little bit about our Patreon content, and of course, we have our episode here at the end of July that was a movie review of Cold Mountain, and that goes very nicely with what we will be discussing here in the Battle of the Crater. Those events are depicted in that movie. And then in August here, we're probably going to be going back to a picture slideshow, so we're going to be covering some of these battlefields that we haven't talked about maybe in the Siege of Petersburg region, and if that sounds like something that would interest you, we do have those slideshows. We have movie reviews, obviously. We have some memoir reviews, and we're probably going to be going back to the well of the memoir review, so we always have an extra episode every month. If that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off around Petersburg, the initial assaults had failed on the city. First, we had Baldy Smith, and then we had the added weight of the Army of the Potomac that could not break the lines that B.G.T. Beauregard had set up. After these engagements, Lee had shifted a majority of his army to Petersburg with a light covering force north of Richmond. With Petersburg still in the hands of the Confederates, Grant was more than willing to commit to try to envelop the city, choking the rebels out. Cutting the main lines of supply coming in was going to be a key part of this. As a result, a 9-month siege would unfold, so when I said we will get comfortable around Petersburg, I truly meant it. The railroad lines coming into the city were going to be key to Grant now that a direct assault had not made Lee's position untenable. The 2nd Corps, which would be commanded temporarily by David Birney, would set their sights on the Weldon Railroad. You remember, of course, John Hancock is going to be in and out of the lineup here. He is suffering from complications of his wounding at Gettysburg, which was actually quite a severe wound, and is eventually going to make it so he will not be able to command troops in the field, but he's still going to be around. It's just sometimes he's going to be in, sometimes he's going to be out. Remember, too, that the Weldon Railroad is one of the main rail lines that is going to be connecting North Carolina to Virginia and to Richmond, of course, so that's why it is very important. It would also actually connect Wilmington to Richmond, and if you're keeping count of how many port cities that the Confederates still hold, how many viable options they have for any kind of support coming in, any kind of supplies coming in from abroad, well, Wilmington is pretty much it at this point. We're going to be talking about Mobile next week, but Wilmington is going to be pretty much it. So connecting Richmond to that city in particular is also going to be important. That's another reason why the Weldon Railroad is crucial. In addition to the action that the 2nd Corps would be conducting against the Weldon Railroad, Grant would also send out cavalry, about 5,000 or so troopers, under James Wilson and August Kautz to hit the South Side Railroad. Now, the South Side Railroad would extend out to the west, reaching toward Lynchburg. In what would become the first battle of the Jerusalem Plank Road, Birney would extend his lines and then advance on June 21st. That road, as we have mentioned, ran parallel with the railroad, which lay a little to the west. The 2nd Corps would advance in the direction of Globe Tavern, which lay along a road connecting the Plank Road to the railroad. From there, Lee had dispatched 2 divisions of A.P. Hill's Corps, Wilcox and Billy Mahone. Mahone had previously worked on the railroad and was very familiar with this territory. He would use the terrain to his advantage and actually strike at the Union troops, hitting the 2nd Corps between Barlow's division and the connection with Wright's 6th Corps. Barlow's division would scatter at the unexpected attack, with many prisoners taken. At the time, they were in the process of erecting earthworks, and so they were unprepared. Gibbon and Mott, the 2 other divisions in the Corps, would likewise fall back, eventually being able to stabilize the line with earthworks and the setting of the sun. Wright had not sent too much in terms of help, his corps being the southernmost, as he was concerned with action toward his front. It was apparent that the hard campaigning had made the 2nd Corps really a shadow of its former self. You can kind of see from their previous combat record, in fact, that there has been really no setbacks recently, right? You could kind of maybe say the Muleshoe perhaps, but the 2nd Corps had been the premier combat troops for the Army of the Potomac for some time now, and really you see our first setback at the Jerusalem Plank Road here. It's kind of like how the Army of Northern Virginia did not necessarily consider themselves to be defeated, right, until, say, Gettysburg. So you kind of have a parallel there. June 23rd would see the Union troops in the 6th Corps again advance toward the railroad, with the Vermont Brigade in an advanced position. The Vermonters would begin to tear up track and be successful in doing some damage before A.P. Hill was again going to counterattack. Forcing the Vermont men back into their entrenchments in the woods, Nathaniel Harris and the Mississippi Brigade, as well as the Floridians, would flank and force their way behind the Yankees, cutting them off and capturing many who still stood waiting for help from their 6th Corps comrades. Wright was afraid to send his men forward, lest they meet the same fate as the 2nd Corps. It should be pointed out that Wright has done a good job in replacing Uncle John Sedgwick following his mortal wounding at Spotsylvania, but he does not do a particularly good job in these early Petersburg engagements. Now, also to piggyback off that comment, you are noticing that the 6th Corps is still here with the Army of the Potomac. That's how far back we're reaching here. They're soon going to be reassigned as Jubal Early gets closer to Washington. This would be late June here that we're talking about with these actions. And then we have early July where Jubal Early is going to be waging not only the Battle of Monocacy, but then he's also going to be approaching the defensive of Washington. So that is when the 6th Corps is going to truly be shifted north. And then they're going to stay up there because they're going to be participating in Sheridan's 1864 Valley Campaign. In the first battle of the Jerusalem Plank Road, we will see some 3,000 Union casualties compared with as many to 500 Confederates. Of those 3,000, maybe as many as 1,700 were actually captured. Meanwhile, Wilson and Kautz would see mixed results in their efforts to destroy track for Grant. They would advance out wide, following the South Side Railroad and making their way toward the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which traveled south toward Danville along the North Carolina border. Initially, they would see only light skirmishing and do some work in destroying track. Making their way to the Stanton River Bridge on this route, the Federal troopers would engage with militia, mostly the old and young, which had been gathered by Captain Benjamin Fairnholt. Now, Fairnholt had been able to put together some less than 1,000 men from the surrounding counties, and he was also able to put up earthworks to protect the vital railroad crossing. Much in the same way that when we talked about the Battle of Lynchburg, there would be a train that would run continuously that would also make the illusion that there were more reinforcements on the way. Wilson initially would dismount and engage these rebels, but the Union cavalry would be repulsed. In fact, so far in this cavalry raid, there had been relatively easy going, right? There would actually be some records of Union troopers talking about how they would be doing a little bit of looting, some destruction, right? Kind of like foreshadowing what we will see in Sherman's March to the Sea. So it's kind of, this is where it starts to turn south for the Federal cavalry. Even though it would be attacking a defensive position that would actually include some railroad ties and cross beams being laid out over the railroad, this should be something that veteran cavalry should have been able to overcome, right? These would be militia troops. They are not regular Confederates. There's limited artillery. A lot of these troopers are going to be the same men who are armed with, say, Spencer repeating carbines, so they are going to be well armed, and yet this ragtag militia unit is going to hold them off at the Stanton River Bridge, and obviously that is going to help keep the siege of Petersburg going on the part of the Confederacy. With Rooney Lee giving chase, the raiders were forced to retire. The Richmond and Danville Railroad was important to supplying Richmond and Petersburg and would remain open until 1865. Union forces had lost some 116 men compared to 34 Confederates. Private Nelson War of the 11th Pennsylvania had received the Medal of Honor in this action for voluntarily joining a charge to secure the body of his company commander. Attempting then to get back to friendly lines, the Union raiders would be attacked at Sapani Church on June 28th by Wade Hampton's cavalry, and then attacked by not only cavalry but Mahone's infantry in the vicinity of Reams Station, which lay a little south of Globe Tavern on the 29th. In all, there had been some track destroyed, but the Union mounted forces had suffered some 1,500 casualties and had to abandon the accompanying artillery pieces. Now, the fact that they had to abandon their artillery is really going to illustrate just how poorly this raid could have gone. And that's a very sharp contrast to the beginning. As we mentioned, it was kind of easy going, but then the Confederate cavalry start to converge. Militia is going to do a good job in corralling them. And then they're almost trapped by infantry as well under Mahone, who's still in that region following your actions there along the Jerusalem Plank Road. So things could have gone very differently and very poorly for Grant for this cavalry raid. Grant would then try to change tact at this point for a variety of reasons. There had been some mining attempts during the Vicksburg campaign, but a large one around the lines at Petersburg might have a desired effect. We will get into the action that will become known as the Crater shortly, but if the Union Army was to shift forces to the north side of the river, attention could be diverted, adding to the chance of success. In addition, the defenses north of the city were relatively lighter, so if a solid punch was made, the city might be taken, meaning any operation at Petersburg would then become irrelevant. To accomplish this task, Grant would turn once again to the 2nd Corps, who, by July, was commanded once again by Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock would be given the independent task, along with Kautz's cavalry, of conducting this raid. The 10th Corps troops under Robert Foster, Godfrey Weitzel's subordinate, would move across the James in late June, digging in and establishing a beachhead. A pontoon bridge was constructed, allowing for more weight to be sent. Defending the lines to the north, as mentioned, was more of a covering force, although Kershaw had been sent there to a strong point at Chaffin's Bluff. Confederate 24-pound artillery would be watching the river in this region, trading shots with the Federal gunboats. Dick Ewell was going to be in overall command of the Richmond defenses. Remember that Lee had decided that he was going to be given a less strenuous command after failing him during the Overland Campaign. With Jubal Early's command in the valley, it made sense to just give him a different job. Hancock would ready his command, now only with 3 divisions under Barlow, Gibbon, and Mott, for the new strike north by late July. The 2nd Corps troops would advance across the James River, but would use a lower crossing, originally designated for the cavalry. As it was, the Union troops were able to gain the other side of the river on July 27th. Hancock could have pursued closer to a main goal, which was the strong position on Chaffin's Bluff. Neutralization of those defenses would have allowed Sheridan's cavalry to push on and raid into and around Richmond, the goal of the operation as a whole. Barlow and Mott would deploy with skirmishers from brigades of Nelson Miles and Regis de Trobriand, advancing against the Confederates under the command of Benjamin Humphreys. Kershaw was not present, and so the Mississippi Brigade commander had the division. Artillery would open up, and the Union troops would catch the Confederates unaware. They would capture several Parrott rifled guns as the rebels withdrew toward Newmarket. Ironically, the guns had been captured from Union forces, and so they were taken back. Confederate cavalry would attempt to hit the Union troops in the flank, but they would be repulsed with artillery and infantry fire. A Confederate trooper would describe his combat experience during this portion of the action. I looked over to the left and perceived about 100 yards from me a bluecoat, partly hid behind one of the larger trees, in the act of taking a cartridge from his cartridge box to reload his rifle. I stuck spurs to my horse and dashed up to the tree, thinking I would compel him to surrender, his gun being empty, but when I arrived there, he met me at the point of his bayonet. Keeping the tree between us, I had drawn my saber when I started toward him, and it now uplifted to cut him down. He was a very large German, weighing about 180 pounds, I would suppose. I called on him to surrender. He said something in German, consigning me in all probability to a warm place. I found myself in a fix. I knew that if I rode off, I would be shot ere I could get out of reach of his bullet, so making the best of a bad bargain, I rode around the tree in hopes of getting a cut with my saber, but as I would ride around and get on the other side, keeping the tree between us. We played go round in merry gold bush for about half an hour, when he became tired of the sport, I suppose, and stepped from behind the tree and made a vicious lunge at me with his bayonet. I had my eye on him and was prepared for him. As he stepped from the shelter of the tree, I made a down cut with my saber simultaneously with the lunge, cleaving through his cap and partly through his skull. His bayonet passed through my right leg, a little above the kneecap, the saddle tree about an inch or more in the side of my horse's back, and he, falling, held onto his rifle in a death grip, the bayonet breaking just above the socket, leaving me pinned to my saddle and no means of extracting myself. I studied a while, and in a few moments made up my mind the best thing I could do was turn back and make tracks for the regimental hospital, hoping to meet another courier and turn my dispatch over to him, which I fortunately did. We don't have a whole lot of recountances of close quarters combat, so this is a particularly interesting segment, I thought. A couple things to take away. I think first and foremost, when he says he thinks he's super heavy at 180 pounds, I think that's kind of indicative of the time, I suppose. Does not make me feel particularly good, but it does show that a lot of these men are much smaller, and certainly with the campaigning, they would have been very skinny. There's always these accountings of the Confederate troops, whether they're going into Maryland or what have you, and they are always recorded as being super lean, so you could imagine they don't weigh a whole lot. The other thing I do want to point out, and it's something that is going to hamper the Union Army in the siege of Petersburg, and that they have a lot of replacement troops, and some of them are going to be immigrants that are coming right off the boat, essentially, and then they're going to be conscripted. So this individual is probably one of those folks who has recently arrived to the country and now is being forced to fight in this war. And we know that from a previous episode, we talked about immigrants and serving. Now, most of them are for the Union. There's a very large amount of Germans that will do so. So we have a case in point example here of a replacement coming into the East. And it's not going to go well toward the combat effectiveness of the Army, but it is going to add bodies into the Army of the Potomac. And that is going to be important as we fight these battles, and Lee is going to lose more and more men. Hancock would have a decision to make, but he had lost the fire he once held. Humphreys' command was unorganized, and a well-placed strike could have been launched before Anderson or Ewell, commanding the Richmond defenses, could help. But the Union troops would pause. The cavalry would probe, but otherwise a general attack was called off, despite Grant being present on the field now. Lee would shuffle in reinforcements in the form of Heath's division, and Richard Anderson would take operational control in the field. Confederate plans were to attack the enemy on the 28th. The Federals were supposing to do likewise. Cavalry probes had revealed that down the line was not turned as of yet. If Hancock's infantry could create enough of a lane, however, then maybe Sheridan could get moving. July 28th would see a resumption of hostilities. Hancock was reinforced by Burge's brigade of the 18th Corps. Amazingly, he was confirming whether he should in fact attack with Meade. Hancock, who in 1863 did not need to seek confirmation about too much at Gettysburg, was seemingly reduced by the campaigning and his wound he had received during that battle. Foster would again demonstrate in his sector of the original beachhead, hopefully pulling troops away from Hancock, who, to be fair, now needed to shift his lines to meet an expanded rebel front. Heath's men held the New Market line while a battle group was forming using several brigades under James Connor, these including Lane's North Carolinians, Hennigan's South Carolinians, and Wofford's Georgians. Connor was a lawyer and a secessionist from South Carolina. He has been in our story since First Manassas, being part of Hampton's famous Legion. The attack would come around the Darby Farm. The Darbytown Road would run parallel to the Newmarket Road, both of which headed into Richmond. The Long Bridge Road would connect the two, running relatively east to west. Protecting this area would be Sheridan's cavalry, waiting to either have Hancock punch a hole or otherwise flank the rebel line so that they could raid into the city. Connor's attacking column would be split in half due to the terrain, which would bode ill for the attack in general. Half of the command would hit Wesley Merritt and Thomas Devon's brigades as they prepared to move forward. The 9th New York in particular would do well to stand against the attacking Confederates, especially out in the open. Lane's brigade would break, his men being rallied by Connor at a fence line for a time. The general having 2 horses shot from under him during the action, owing to the fierce nature of the combat. The other brigades in the meantime had hit David Gregg's brigade and scattered it, capturing an artillery piece of a battery that probably aided in stopping the Confederate advance. With additional horsemen from Kautz and the other Federal troops now able to hit the rebels in the flank, the forces would be forced to retire. Hancock would not get off an attack on the rebels and actually bump heads with Gibbon, who he had thought was ordered to the cavalry. No order given, Gibbon would eventually reply, "General Hancock, I'm either very stupid this morning or you are intelligible." As a result of this disagreement with Hancock, Gibbon would actually seek to be removed from the Second Corps following this campaign. Hancock, though, would pull his men back into the line around Petersburg, the attack called off, especially at the large buildup of the Confederates. Anderson would have a large amount of reinforcements arrive, giving him maybe an opportunity to isolate and destroy Hancock, which would have been just the kind of action that Lee was looking for. But he did not move until July 30th, and by that time, the Second Corps was safely back across the river. First Deep Bottom was a missed opportunity for Lee and Hancock alike. Not very many general officers turned in good performances here. At the cost of 488 Federals and 679 rebels, Grant now had more weight in the lines around Petersburg. As mentioned, the Battle of First Deep Bottom would be significant in that if it worked, it would have scrubbed the plan for probably the most famous incident of the Siege of Petersburg, the battle that would become known as the Battle of the Crater. Now, the origins of the crater lay in a common tactic of siege warfare since ancient times, being mining. You wonder where the phrase undermine comes from. Well, there you go. Famously, there were mining operations in sieges like Malta in 1565 and Vienna in 1683, and in the Civil War, we have had limited examples of this tactic being implemented. Vicksburg would probably be the best example, a mine being detonated there that resulted in very little gained, as the Confederates were made partially aware and had pulled out the defenders. Members of the 48th Pennsylvania, a regiment made up of many coal miners from the Pottsville, Pennsylvania area, would come up with a plan to present to their commanding officer, Henry Pleasants. These were veteran troops who had served since New Bern and actually had been involved in storming Burnside's Bridge in Antietam, but their talents in working mines and railroads in the Allegheny Mountains would come into play. Pleasants in turn would ask Robert Potter for permission to begin, who then got the approval from Burnside. While Meade and Grant remained skeptical, the work would commence as early as June. The mining operation eventually expanded to the entire 400 men of the regiment, getting whiskey as a reward for their service. The tunnel itself, some 510 feet long, was less than 4 feet high. A ventilation system using wooden logs was implemented, and fires would be made to hide detection. The dirt would be covertly removed from the lines via cracker boxes, as secrecy was the name of the game for the miners. Indeed, there had been some mention of skirmish lines fraternizing or otherwise coming to agreements about opening fire, and this in the region was strictly prohibited. The men working on the mine were sworn to secrecy. 8,000 pounds of gunpowder would eventually be loaded into the mine, and placed under the Confederate works at a place called Elliott's Salient, the end of the mine forming a T. By late July, everything would be ready. We talked a little bit about how in the initial assaults of Petersburg, not really a whole lot changes in terms of how far the armies are from each other. And in some places where they stop following those initial 3 days of assaults, we will see them to be fairly close. Where the location of the mine is, where Elliott's Salient is, this is a particularly close part of the line, so that would be partially why. The less that you can have to mine to get to your opponent's defenses, the better, right? Now with that, you're closer, so secrecy again would be very key to the operation, and that's why you're using your cracker boxes to remove the dirt, because if you see on the Confederate side, if you're looking over there and you see, wow, these guys have a huge pile of dirt, I wonder what they're doing, well, that's going to be an issue, right? You're going to be like, well, they obviously are digging something, but what are they digging? And if the answer is there's 8,000 pounds of explosives under me, well, you're probably going to be telling somebody that, and then the plan is not going to work. Now, Burnside would initially wish for Edward Ferraro's division of United States Colored Troops to spear the assault. For such an important attack, this was the freshest division, and they were more than willing to get into the fight. By this point, though, relations between Meade and Burnside had deteriorated. Burnside wished to have command of all troops that would support his 9th Corps, and Meade obviously is going to refuse this. Likewise, the usage of the United States Colored Troops would be vetoed. There had been a negative perception of the 54th Massachusetts attacking Fort Wagner, making it seem like they were being used for cannon fodder. Now, there is a myth that Ferraro's division is given special training, like they are actually the ones who know what they're doing in terms of the assault, and that's why the Battle of the Crater fails, in that there were troops who did not know what they were supposed to do during the attack. That's probably false. We see very limited amounts of special training for any kind of assault by federal troops, so it's very unlikely that Ferraro's division would have been given any kind of additional training. Now, they might have been given more instruction, perhaps, and they might have had more time to plan in terms of their officers, but they're probably not going to have been much more prepared than, say, their White Division comrades. So, with Ferraro not being able to lead the assault, Burnside is going to turn to his remaining division commanders. He will have them draw lots to determine who is going to lead the attack. Unfortunately for the Union, James Ledlie would be lucky and win the draw. Now, we have talked before about Ledlie. We have talked before about North Anna, where he was drunk and led his brigade into a very tough attack on a very strong Confederate position. And again, he had a poor performance at the First Battle of Petersburg, where again he was drunk and forgot that he was commanding a division. So that should tell you all you need to know about Ledlie and his approach to this attack. Wilcox and Potter would support him with Ferraro in reserve, 9,000 men in all. An additional 8,000 from the 18th Corps and 5,000 from the 5th Corps would be prepared. Facing them would be Beauregard's command, Bushrod Johnson's division. Ransom's brigade, Elliott's South Carolinians, and Wise's brigade, commanded by Thomas Good, were immediately on hand. Further afield would be Hoke's brigade and, crucially, Mahone's division of A.P. Hill's Corps. July 30th would mark the date for the jump-off. The detonation of the mine would be delayed due to darkness, another disagreement between Burnside and Meade. At 4:45 a.m., however, gunpowder would ignite, blowing a large hole in the Confederate works. Members of the 48th Pennsylvania actually had bravely entered the mine to find that the fuses had initially gone out, relit them, and then escaped the mine. The initial explosion had killed 350 men of the South Carolina regiments and had destroyed 2 Napoleon cannon. Ledlie's division, including the 14th New York Heavy Artillery and the 100th Pennsylvania and Bartlett's brigade, would attack. We have an account from the perspective of both regiments. First, the 100th. Waiting in terrible suspense, minutes passed and rounded into an hour, but still no explosion, as the fuses had gone out. The intense anxiety lingered, while every heart, in feverish emotion, and most profound concern, was depicted on every countenance, until 4:44 a.m., when the explosion occurred. The delay was caused by the dampened fuses, but they were relit by Jacob Doughty and Sergeant Henry Rees of the 48th Pennsylvania at 4:15 o'clock. At its occurrence, there was a dull, heavy roar, as an earthquake shock, when earth, cannon, and garrison were blown 200 feet in the air, and a yawning chasm marked the spot where the salient once existed. Before referring to the assault proper, we will hear from several eyewitnesses, and first from Lieutenant Colonel Pleasance, who had this matter in charge. I stood on top of our breastworks and witnessed the effect of the explosion on the enemy. It seemed to paralyze them, and the breach was 400 or 500 yards in breadth. The rebels in the force, both on the right and the left of the explosion, left their works, and for over an hour not a shot was fired by the artillery. There was no fire from the infantry from the front, or at least half an hour, none from the left for 20 minutes, but a few shots from the right. We quote from the history of the 36th Massachusetts, one of the regiments that took part in this engagement, page 234, as follows. At 42 minutes past 4, we witnessed a volcano and experienced an earthquake. With a tremendous burst which shook the hills around, a column of earth shot upward to an enormous height, bearing the Elliott salient, its guns and garrison, and making a crater chasm 150 feet long, 97 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. Pleasant's work had been terribly successful. E.P. Alexander, referring to this explosion in his Military Memoirs of a Confederate on page 569, had this to say concerning the results of the explosion. The bulk of the earth fell immediately around the crater, mingled with the debris of 2 guns, 22 cannoneers, and perhaps 250 infantry, which had been carried in the air. Quite a number of those fell safely, were dug out, and rescued alive by the assaulting column. Some not aroused were lost, covered up in the bomb-proofs of the adjacent trenches by the falling earth. We will now listen to the description as given by Joseph Nelson, Company F of the Roundheads, who was taken prisoner at the engagement. We turned our eyes toward the doomed fort when the time had arrived for the explosion, and in a few minutes, a heaving and trembling of the earth followed by a heavy explosion, and a huge mass of earth arose with all contents of the fort, caissons, timbers, and guns, small arms, haversacks, blankets, and the soldiers of the garrison. It resembled a huge fountain. The mass seemed to stand still when it reached its height, and fell as a shower from a fountain. Owing to the hazardous undertaking and the extraordinary risk attending its fulfillment or successful accomplishment, lots were cast to select the attacking column for the preliminary assault. In this way, the 1st Division of the 9th Corps, commanded by General Ledlie, was selected. An unfortunate choice as relates to the commander, as the sequel clearly proves. It might be well to state that the 100th Pennsylvania was in line for the attack from the midnight to the 29th, and was placed as rear regiment of the brigade, and therefore was not responsible for the confusion or mix-up which resulted when the fort was entered. When the order was given, "Charge the works, 1st Division," bayonets were fixed, and the assaulting division, the 3rd Brigade leading, leaped over their works, moving over a plain of about 200 yards, constantly exposed to a flank fire from the enemy, now fully aroused, and which came from the right and left of the fort. The troops passed through the covered ways, but were halted owing to the work of removing the abattis in front of both lines, as this had been imperfectly accomplished by the pioneers employed for that purpose, causing considerable delay. When in readiness for the assault, the right of the 100th rested a short distance to the left of the entrance for the mine, and it entered at the extreme left of the fort, moving to the rear embankment. When the fort was reached, after a short delay, a number of the troops, including many of the 100th, moved over the open space in rear of the enemy's works to the crest of Cemetery Hill and near the streets of Petersburg, but were compelled to retreat, being unsupported. We will again hear from Joseph Nelson. We were not supported as we were to be, and were obliged to fall back to the fort after being near enough to Petersburg to see into its streets. A main part of the troops were, as part, had to remain in the fort to defend it from the flanks, and the enemy still occupied the right and left flank of the blown fort. So we fell back to the fort and helped out many Johnnies, who were still buried up to their knees, waists, and armpits. We dug them and got them water, and did not knock them in the head, as they reported. In this place, which may be likened to a seething cauldron, most of the assaulting force was compelled to remain and to constantly defend themselves from the enemy on the right and left for over 2 hours, or until the belated charge was made by the colored troops, when the greater part of their ammunition was expended. So a couple things to take away from this quote here. There are those who put together these compilation kind of unit histories, right? And will use a lot of sources in their histories. So that's why we got a little bit of bonus quotes, including from E.P. Alexander, right? After the war, there's a lot of letter writing, as you see in these memoirs, of back and forth, hey, tell me what happened from your perspective, and, I can tell you what happened from mine, and that's how they kind of put these things together, right? The other thing I do want to also point out is that there's a lot of different times here. All these guys have different times, and we've mentioned this before, but everybody has different times on their watch. So it's hard to determine in some of these Civil War battlefields exactly when did things happen, because everybody has a different time on their watch. It's not like they were able to connect to Wi-Fi and make sure all their watches were synced up. That's why a assault like at Vicksburg that was supposed to be synchronized, you have to synchronize your watch, and that way everybody is going to be jumping off at the same time. We have also an account from the 14th New York Heavy Artillery. The men dozed and rested, and a couple of hours before daylight, awaiting developments. Suddenly the earth trembled, and a black pyramid shot into the air, so close that it seemed as though it was spreading after the upward force was spent. It would fall on and crush those nearest. It was so startling that the first 2 lines of men broke, for believing to be an earthquake, or Confederate mine sprung upon us. No one believed that a Confederate fort was so near. The 14th New York Heavy Artillery, to which I belonged, formed a line, the third line, and was Colonel Marshall's own regiment. With 2 lines in front, and the familiar presence of their own commander to encourage them, these men remained comparatively steady, although there was confusion for a brief spell. Just how far this confusion set back the movement will be seen from the experiences of the first moments. Lieutenant Thompson of Company B was thrown into a mud hole by the shock, and just as he came up blinded and bespattered before his astonished soldiers, the call rang out, "Forward!" Forward men across those breastworks in front, and these were as high as a man's shoulder. There were no steps or ladders, and this unlucky lieutenant scraped the mud from his eyes, repeated the orders, and climbed up the logs, for the works at the time were more than a high terrace wall than a field breastwork. Some of the men put bayonets into the walls and made steps, and a few stood on the top and lent hands to their fellows. When 20 men of Company B had joined their lieutenant on the works, he ordered them to align, but Colonel Marshall called out, "No time for that, Lieutenant. Go to the crest." So it stood with the whole regiment, and but a handful were ready at the first jump. These charged in companies by the flank. Our artillery opened up at once, and shells went screaming overhead, and puffs and clouds of smoke from the shell from the yawning pit made by the explosion obscured the view and added to the confusion. About 150 men were close to Colonel Marshall and the colors. The more came straggling on as fast as they could get over the works, and the grand dash was made by this handful. At the crater, a slanting pit was open, and each side of it the Confederates were now alert, although they were not cool enough for action. In the pit, powder smoke issued from the crevices. Guns were seen half buried, the heads or limbs of half-buried men wriggled in the loose earth. The command came again, "Go ahead." There was a section of the exploded work remaining, and here in the breastworks alongside men were seen. In front, beyond the hole, a Confederate battery was firing into the pathway from our works, and a shot cut a man from Company C in 2. The men in the pit and near it surrendered or ran away, and the flag of the 14th New York Heavy Artillery was planted on the side of the old fort. The enemy on the flanks and beyond came to their senses at the sight of this flag and opened with bullets. Our men saw that all around them were superior numbers, and even from the rear they received fire, for there were traverses running toward our own lines, and sheltered men were firing across the plateau and reversely into the crater. Still, the determination was to push on, and a dash was made for the second breastwork. Here the Confederates made a stand. Some of our men got so close that guns were clubbed, and Sergeant James S. Hill of Company C took a regimental battle flag by force. The fire from all sides was hot, and the men fell back to the old fort and into the crater. It seemed now to those on the spot that the best thing to do was to defend the breach as a basis for forward movements. For there were Confederates all about, possibly a number sufficient to recapture it. Colonel Marshall and some of his officers and men got the old cannon into position and opened on the Confederates that were nearest. By this time, other regiments had come up, and the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery of our brigade joined this work. General Hartranft came in with the command, and when he saw action of Marshall's men, called out, 3 cheers for the 14th. The brigades following Marshall's moved against the breastworks on the flanks of the crater, but they had to face artillery and muskets at every step. As the lines broke, the men inevitably came to the crater. There were now on the scene detachments from several commands, without a supreme commander. Officers and men alike called for definite purpose and orders. Our brigade had entered the breach and could not advance until the flanks were cleared. The brigade sent after us to clear the flanks had been beaten off and had taken refuge in the pit. Difficulties increased every second because the Confederates grew bolder and their fire began to tell. Every fresh advance from our supports was anxiously watched, but in the end, despairing curses went up because the unsuccessful columns fell back and packed the overcrowded hole. The wounded men came into the pit in preference of going to their own lines because the way back was swept by the enemy. After the first hour, the scene in the crater was terrible. Refugees found that shots fell there as well as outside, and many who came in looking for safety met disaster. The last rally was then. The colored troops moved out of their works in splendid order, which promised us success. Now, the objective of the attack would be Cemetery Hill, a rise of ground 400 yards behind the rebel works. Ledley's division having entered the fight, many of the men advanced into the crater, brigades being jumbled up, and the stunned rebels starting to make a defense using their remaining trench lines and traverses. The men were not prepared in their attack, taking time to get out of their own earthworks, which caused valuable time. We saw that from both of these accounts that we just went over, right? We didn't have sufficient clearing of the earthworks for the assaulting column to get through, right? That should have been done. Pioneers should have been able to do that, get some paths through the abattis so that they could actually get at the Confederates, right? You also see where a lot of these individuals are going to advance straight into this very large hole. We have accounts of individuals who are either going to help Confederates because there are Confederates who are kind of stumbling around, right? Those who survived the blast. Then you also have individuals who are even going to stop and look into the hole. They're going to be like, wow, this is a really big hole. And they're just going to kind of stop. In the meantime, you have Confederates who are starting to respond to this threat. And most notably, the artillery is actually going to be responding in kind. Like, there's a situation on the battlefield where at a certain point, the only thing that is standing between the Union troops and getting into Petersburg itself is going to be Confederate artillery. So while in most battlefield situations that we've seen through the Civil War, the Confederate artillery is going to be lacking when compared to their Union counterparts, at this point you have veteran artillery units who are going to do good work in suppressing this Union advance. There would be true lack of organization on the part of James Ledley, who would be drunk in a bomb-proof by this point. Likewise, with the Confederates responding, the men would take cover in the crater itself, which would then create a bottleneck for any kind of reinforcements. At the orders of the intoxicated Ledley, Farrar's division would also enter the fight. The 43rd United States Colored Troops would perform well in attacking and capturing rebel guns beyond the crater. Henry Thomas, commanding the 2nd Brigade, would right of the action. The instant I reached the 1st Brigade, I attempted to charge, but the 31st was disheartened at its loss of its officers and could not be gotten out promptly. Captain Dempey and Lieutenant Pinnell and myself then attempted to lead them, but the fire was so hot that half of the few who came out of their works were shot. Here Lieutenant Pinnell was killed and riddled through and through. He died with a flag in his hand, doing everything an officer could do to lead his men. Immediately after this, I was ordered by Brigadier General Farrar to advance in concert with Colonel Siegfried and take the crest. I ordered the 29th this time to lead, which it did gallantly, closely followed by the 28th and a few of the 23rd, when it was at once engaged by a heavy charging column of the enemy, and after a struggle driven back over our rifle pits. At this moment, a panic commenced. The black and white troops came pouring back together. A few, more gallant than the rest, without organization, but guided by a soldier's instinct, remained on the side of the pits nearest our line and held the enemy at bay some 10 or 15 minutes, until they were nearly all shot away. Whether we fought well or not, the scores of our dead lying thick as if mowed down by the hand of some mighty reaper, and the terrible loss of officers can best attest. So while Ferrar's troops do enter the combat, there is a little bit of an issue with them and how they move in. In order to inspire them, the officers had told them to yell out "no quarter" and to remember Fort Pillow. And this is one of those ramifications of Fort Pillow that we see in battlefields moving from there on out, right? Well, the Confederates are going to hear that there is going to be no quarter given to them, and so they're going to be responding kind and kind, as we will soon see. The other thing that we should mention is that the confusion is going to be going up the ladder of officers, right? Burnside is going to be losing control of the situation. He's going to be thinking that moving more reinforcements in is going to be the way to go, right? But also, he is requesting that Meade send his men in as well, the rest of the army that Burnside wanted to have control over. But Meade is more concerned with establishing this breakthrough, right? When in reality, had there been a general assault at that point, the Confederates are going to have to turn their attention elsewhere. Because there's only this one breakthrough point with the 9th Corps men, they're able to concentrate all their effort on repelling that. So while Meade is saying, well, obviously they need more help at this breakthrough because it's not happening, if he had actually rolled forward some of these other men and say the 5th Corps, then there could have been a bigger breakthrough and there could have been order established. There are all kinds of conflicting reports about how long it takes for the Confederates to start repulsing the enemy. And we see in some of these accounts, even it's almost immediately. Some are saying, well, it takes a long time for them to respond, right? Well, either way you cut it, this is an operation that is going to require there to be quick action, and there just isn't on the part of the Union officer corps. And at one point, there's all these correspondences going back and forth between Meade and Burnside. At one point, Meade is actually going to threaten Burnside with a court-martial as a result of this action. So that should tell you exactly how things are going that far up the line. Lee filtered in Billy Mahone's division into a counterattack that would drive the Union troops away, despite some efforts to hold the line. Indeed, north of the crater, troops under Hartranft would actually hold the rebel works, but they would run low on ammunition. That being said, though, Billy Mahone's brigade and also that of Hall's Georgians, who are going to participate in the counterattack, are actually going to suffer pretty heavy casualties. But these troops, once again, are going to be fired up by the fact that there are United States colored troops who are now taking shelter in the crater, having advanced beyond, but unsupported, were not able to capitalize on that success, so they're going to be fired up about that. The Battle of the Crater would then turn into a turkey shoot by some accounts, an Alabama soldier writing that so many weapons with fixed bayonets were on the ground that rebels were able to pick them up and throw them like harpoons into the trapped Federals. Burnside would then realize that the attack was a failure and call off the strike. However, the Union troops that had gained the crater, and in some places the Confederate works, would try to hold on, because they were not able to get back across the open ground. That is, as one account we saw, being swept by the Confederate artillery and small arms fire. And actually, for some time in the July heat, these men are going to be in the crater and engaging in firefighting with Confederates. And in a famous incident, a Confederate is going to yell down into the crater, "Why don't you all just surrender?" And a Union man is supposed to have replied, "Well, we would surrender if you would just let us." And that gives you an idea of the confused nature and in some cases, unfortunately, the savage nature of the fighting, where a lot of the Confederates are not going to take prisoners, especially with the United States colored troops. And in some cases, even, you're going to have the unfortunate incidences of the Union white troops turning on their black compatriots, trying to gain favor with the Confederates as they're coming. They're going to be shooting them down as well. So it's just going to be a mess in terms of the end of this assault. And unfortunate from a variety of different sources. Now, the Confederates would actually take prisoners, both black and white prisoners, in this engagement, and they will march them together through the streets of Petersburg. And for some of these captured white Union troops, this is going to be seen as the ultimate disgrace, right? You're being marched with these men who, although they're your comrades, and they performed probably just as well as anyone on that day, you're still ashamed to be marching with them, and that's another unfortunate thing that will result following the Battle of the Crater. The Confederates had lost some 1,500 men to 3,798 Union casualties. Much in the same way as after the initial assaults on Petersburg and the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, there will be a lack of an immediate truce on this part of the field, and that's going to be on part of the Confederates, right? The initial request is going to go to Lee, and Lee's going to take his time and then eventually say, well, I can't actually give you the approval of this truce. You're just going to have to go to General Beauregard, who has this part of the line. So a little bit petty, you might say, right? We had that a little bit with the Cold Harbor truces, but unfortunately, that would mean that a lot of the individuals who are wounded, they're going to die from their wounds or even lack of water, right? Because, again, this is July in Virginia. It's super hot, and there are accounts of the men who are then going to go out there as burial details, and these bodies have essentially disintegrated because they've been left out in the heat. And they are going to be buried mostly where they lay, right? Out in the fields. And so that's another example of how we have these signs in Civil War battlefields of how there is hollowed ground, because you never know, there might be still individuals who died who are still buried out there. Whether it was right or wrong, Ferrero is going to be blamed for the failed attack. Burnside is going to receive some of that blame, as would Ledlie and Wilcox after a court of inquiry. Burnside is going to eventually be removed from the 9th Corps, as would Ledlie and Ferraro. The attack having failed, Grant once again would settle into a siege. So we will go ahead and stop there for now. This week we jump back into the action around Petersburg. We saw action around the Weldon Railroad and the Wilson-Kautz Cavalry Raid, attempting to destroy the valuable Confederate rail lines. We then fought First Deep Bottom and the Battle of the Crater, 2 failed attempts to break through the rebel line. Stymied, Grant would now shift back to continue to squeeze out Lee. Next week, we're going to head elsewhere. We will head to Mobile Bay and see some naval action there. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the Patreon, as well as website. Support for general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.